campaign struck at the heart of the Axis powers' manufacturing centers, transportation systems, airfields, oil refineries, and other resources required to pursue the war. The America of World War II was an industrial powerhouse, and it built the greatest air fleet the world has ever known. American bombers dropped millions of tons of bombs on Hitler's Third Reich in Europe and on the Pacific Empire of Japan. World War II was the greatest catastrophe that mankind has ever seen. The death toll all over the world, both civilian and military combined, was around 60 million people. But there is no doubt that America's bombing campaigns materially shortened the conflict. The courageous young men who flew America's heavy bombers and carried the war into the heartland of the enemy to destroy his war-making ability are the often unsung heroes of World War II. This is especially true of the bomber crews who flew against the Empire of Japan in the Pacific. With far fewer resources available to them, and with much less publicity than their counterparts in Europe received, they were not as well known at the time, and they are too often forgotten today. Hundreds of thousands of young men flew in U.S. Army Air Corps bombers during World War II. Photos of bomber crews standing beside their aircraft can be found today in old family photo albums, in boxes and trunks stored in attics and basements, and in history books about the war. Casualty rates among air crews were high, and in many cases these pictures show crews that never returned home, and often even their fates are unknown. In the vast Pacific theater, many aircraft simply vanished into the trackless jungle, where a crash-landing airplane would barely make a mark in the jungle canopy. And hundreds of them still lie there today, along with the remains of their crews, awaiting discovery. Each year, a few more are found, and a few more men finally make it home. Even more bombers and crews disappeared into the endless expanses of the Pacific Ocean, less often as a result of enemy action than from the frequent violent tropical storms, mechanical failures, navigation errors, or just plain bad luck. Today, when you look at the faces of the young men in the old crew photos, you can't help wondering about their thoughts at the time, their ambitions and hopes, and their fates. Even the ones who did return home did so in 1945 at the end of the war, 70 years ago. Most of them married and became parents, and then grandparents and great-grandparents, and many have lived their lives to the end and are gone. Sometimes you wish you could talk to these men and ask them questions about what they experienced and how they felt about it all. But what chance do you have to do so today, 7 decades after the end of World War II? Well, sometimes, even today, you can get lucky.
Get it all there. That was when
James H. Horner piloted B-24 bombers and flew 45 combat missions against the Japanese between May of 1944 and April of 1945. Now 94 years old and retired in Florida, he can still vividly recall those days and those missions. Another member of this crew also remembers those days and those dangerous bombing missions.
As we got over the Jap target, he says, "I'm going to throw this."
Jamie Baca, or properly pronounced in Spanish, Jaime Baca, was one of the 2 waist gunners of the crew. Today 92 years old and active as a deacon in the Catholic Church near Albuquerque, New Mexico, he too can recall his experiences in the Pacific War in vivid detail. A third member of this crew, the navigator, Tom Theobald, lives today in a small town in Iowa.
Just from the position as mess officer.
He's 94 years old, and like the others, he's still going strong. As the navigator, it was his job to plot the course to wherever the bomber was going. He had a reputation for being one of the best. In 50 combat missions, he always managed to get the bomber to the target and then find the way home again, day or night. Bomber crews were usually referred to by the name of their pilot. So the Horner crew belonged to the 90th Bomb Group of the 5th Air Force. Their symbol, which was painted on the tails of all their bombers, was a skull over crossed bombs. They were known as the Jolly Rogers. They referred to themselves as the best damn heavy bomb group in the world. Their main rivals for that title were the bomb groups of the 8th Air Force in Europe, known to history as the Mighty Eighth. Since most of the well-known war correspondents were with the U.S. forces in Europe, the 8th got all the publicity, while the 5th Air Force, out in the Pacific, was not often heard from. In fact, some historians have referred to the 5th Air Force today as the Forgotten Fifth. The main reason that the 5th Air Force is not as well known today is because early in the war, Prime Minister Churchill and President Roosevelt had decided that most of the resources devoted to the war would be used against Hitler in Europe. Hitler's army was rampaging across Europe, enslaving one country after another, and threatening an invasion of England. His U-boats were sinking American shipping right off the New England coast. The plan was for the Allies to knock out Hitler first and free Europe before turning attention to the Japanese in the Pacific. In the meantime, whatever forces could be spared from the fight in Europe would be used to hold the Japanese in check, or if possible, to slowly drive them back. For the 5th Air Force in the Pacific, this policy meant a constant shortage of airplanes, and replacements for those lost were hard to get.
We would wait weeks before a delivery of a new airplane.
The members of the Horner crew had thought that they were headed for Europe, but as it turned out, they were one of the crews that were sent to the Pacific. As with all bomber crews, each member was a specialist in his job, and each had been trained separately in a different school for the task that he was assigned. As the pilot, Lieutenant Horner from Hazel Park, Michigan, was the commander of the bomber sitting in the cockpit's left seat. Like the captain of a ship, he made all decisions regarding the flight and operation of the aircraft, and was responsible for the safety and efficiency of his crew. And since their safety depended to a large extent on his flying skills, the crew was happy to discover that they had been teamed up with one of the best B-24 pilots around.
He was a highly skilled pilot and a very gutsy pilot too, I would say. You know, I look back and I said the skill of that man is what saved us a number of times. He was a really first-class pilot.
After graduating from high school, James Horner was working in a defense plant, running a lathe 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. In June of 1942, on his 21st birthday, James, his brother, and a friend challenged each other to take the Air Corps entrance exam at the Federal Building in downtown Detroit. James was the only one who passed. 6 months later, he was in uniform and in pilot training, working his way through the Air Corps' primary, basic, and multi-engine trainers. But flying in these small training planes had done nothing to prepare him for his first close-up look at the monstrous 4-engine, 30-ton B-24 heavy bomber.
The instructor takes us out, and we walk up alongside this airplane. It's 11 feet up to the pilot's window. It's further from the pilot to the end of the wingtip on one side of the airplane than the biggest airplane we've ever been in, including the airliners. The wing's 110 feet long, and you're supposed to park this with the wingtips 6 inches apart. They're going to tell you to fly this thing up in the air when you don't even think they could get it up in the air on jacks. Plane weighs 35 tons, full of gas, ready to go. It's got 4 engines with 1,200 horsepower each. Well, at that time, I knew I was in the wrong business. I knew I should have joined the Navy.
However, despite his initial misgivings, by the time the flight training was over, few people could fly a B-24 as well as Lieutenant James Horner. The co-pilot of the crew was Lieutenant Alan G. Cooper from San Francisco, California. He had been trained to be the pilot of a B-26, but when that medium bomber was phased out, he became a co-pilot for B-24s. As the co-pilot, he was second in command of the bomber and sat in the right seat in the cockpit. The co-pilot shared flying duties with the pilot during the long hours of flying a mission, and he was ready to take over as pilot in the event that the pilot became incapacitated. The bombardier was Lieutenant Sylvester A. Ostafin from Detroit, Michigan. Since the purpose of a bomber such as the B-24 was to bomb targets, it could be said that he had the most important job in the crew. He had nothing to do until the bomber made its short run over the target, and then his skill made all the difference to the success of a mission. During the minutes of the bomb run, he took control of the bomber through his bomb sight and released the bombs at just the right instant to accurately hit the target. Lieutenant Tom Theobald from Olwine, Iowa, was the crew's navigator. Using his maps, plotting tools, mechanical flight computer, and radio fixes, he plotted the route to and from targets or anywhere else the bomber was going, and provided the pilot with compass headings, checkpoints, and advice on steering an accurate course. The flight engineer was Sergeant Ernest L. Eady from Orange, Texas. The flight engineer was the mechanic of the crew, and he usually knew more about the B-24 than any other crewman, including the pilot. In a lot of the old films, you can see the flight engineer standing in the top hatch of the bomber, watching the engines start. He checked out the airplane before each flight, monitored the running of the engines, the transfer of fuel between gas tanks and engines, and he kept track of the fuel burn. In mechanical emergencies, he was the one the pilot turned to. The engineer was also usually the top turret gunner. Sergeant J. W. Dale from Pleasant Hill, Missouri, was the left waist gunner. The B-24 had large square openings or windows on each side of the fuselage between the wings and the tail. In both of these waist windows, a gunner manned a single .50 caliber machine gun on a flexible mount as a defense against enemy fighter planes. At their stations, the two waist gunners worked back to back, or side to side. The radio operator was Sergeant Doy E. Bruni from Charleston, West Virginia. The radio operator's position was in the upper fuselage behind the cockpit. The radio man was the bomber's connection with the outside world, and he also assisted the navigator in taking position fixes. To save weight, the B-24s in the Pacific had no belly turrets, only a machine gun or sometimes a pair of them, firing through a circular hole in the floor where the turret used to be. And this belly gun was manned by Sergeant Bruni when he wasn't needed at his radio. Sergeant Edmund Rogalski of Illinois was the nose gunner. He operated a hydraulically powered turret on the nose of the bomber, and his job was to ward off frontal attacks by enemy fighter planes. His turret was equipped with twin .50 caliber machine guns. The right waist gunner was Sergeant Jaime Baca of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he was also the plane's armorer. As the armorer, he was trained to inspect, repair, and maintain all aircraft armament, including the bomb release mechanism and the machine guns. When bombs were loaded aboard the bomber, they were not armed. It was the armorer's job to remove the safety pins and arm the bombs before they were dropped on the target.
I would pull the safety pins out of the bombs before we dropped them. The pilot would call me and says, time to pull out the safety pins. And I would go on this little catwalk, 8 inches wide, and you go in there and I'd be plucking all the safety pins out of the bombs.
Sergeant Kenneth I. Carter from Kansas was the bomber's tail gunner. From his position in the tail of the aircraft with twin 50 caliber machine guns facing rearward, he had a panoramic view of bombers in following formations, as well as of anti-aircraft fire or flak exploding in the sky around him. Sergeant Carter defended the bomber against enemy fighter plane attacks from the rear. Everyone in the bomber who manned a gun had attended gunnery school. Sergeant Baca had been to the gunnery school at Laredo Army Airfield in Texas. He remembers that the course started with skeet shooting, firing shotguns at clay targets.
A lot of it was practicing with skeet shooting, with a shotgun, and they would send one of those little clay things. And we ended up with big black and blue shoulders from all the recoil. So some of the guys later on, they would stuff some sweater or something in there to avoid that recoil. Then they would send us on little planes, and they would have a tow plane flying with a tow, and we would fire at that.
Having grown up on a farm shooting at rabbits and bullfrogs, Sergeant Baca had a natural aptitude for gunnery. Out of the 400 students in his gunnery class, Baca finished in the top 5. He was offered bribes to remain at the school as a gunnery instructor, but he declined the offer, saying he'd rather go to combat. He never told his mother that he could have had a safe job in the States for the duration of the war.
The top 5 men were picked to remain as instructors, and I was in that group. And I immediately told them I didn't want to stay there and do that. I wanted to get into combat. Right away they said, we'll give you an immediate promotion, we'll give you a 2-week furlough, we'll give you a Class A pass that you can leave the base anytime you're not on duty, and you'll be here for the duration.
And you turned it down.
Yeah.
And your mother probably would have been very upset.
I never told them a word about that. Never.
So this crew boasted at least one top-notch gunner in addition to its superb pilot, which increased everyone's chances of surviving the war. Another essential skill for survival, especially in the vast expanses of the Pacific, where getting lost could be fatal, was navigation. The navigation duties fell to Lieutenant Theobald. Theobald, like many young men, had joined the Air Corps hoping to become a pilot. However, his vision was not perfect, and that disqualified him from either pilot or bombardier training. You didn't need perfect eyesight to become a navigator, but you did need a college-level understanding of mathematics. When Theobald told the classification officer that he had not been to college, the officer replied that he didn't think Theobald would make it through navigation training. That only made him all the more determined to succeed.
I did not qualify for pilot training. My eyes were not good. I didn't qualify as a bombardier. The only thing left was that I could possibly be a navigator. But I can remember that officer said, well, how much college have you had? And I said, well, I've never been to college. He said, well, you probably never make it as a navigator. But that was all I needed as an incentive. I was going to make it as a navigator.
And make it he did. Not only did he make it through navigation school, he became one of the best navigators in the Air Corps. In combat missions that required over 14 hours in the air and covered thousands of miles of mostly water in both daylight and darkness, Lieutenant Theobald always got the bomber to the target and then steered his crew safely home again. After they had attended their various specialty schools all over the country, the crewmen assembled at March Field, California, where this picture was taken in February of 1944. There they became acquainted with each other and began flying the B-24 bomber, learning to work together as a team. However, flying at March Field was a risky business. Many of the bombers used for training there were worn-out combat veterans that had been brought back from the war fronts, and these weary airplanes also suffered unintentional daily abuse, such as hard landings by inexperienced pilots. Maintenance on the dilapidated bombers seems also to have been subpar.
There at March Field, they had some old wrecks. Boy, they were in bad shape.
On the first day there, looking down at the airstrip from a quarters that I was assigned to, I saw a B-24 come into the runway and crash. What we were training in, these B-24s were all war-weary planes that had been returned from Europe. And also we were using a lesser octane fuel than what they used in the combat zones. And so all of this didn't add up to a very good feeling about the training.
Some of them were bombers that had come back from overseas, all battered and everything else. We used to dread getting on those things.
As a result, there were numerous crashes with the loss of entire crews. On one black day, James Horner remembers seeing 4 crashed bombers burning around the airfield at the same time. One instructor pilot, a combat veteran, requested that he be sent back to the war front because, he said, training flights at March Field were more dangerous than combat flying.
Well, we were continually aware how unsafe those planes were, and we dreaded, but we went up on them.
Mr. Baca remembers a day when 6 bunks suddenly became vacant in their barracks when another cruise bomber crashed and they were all killed.
We lost a crew, 10 men went down on a bomber and they just crashed, and all of them were, and 6 of those men were in my barracks, and I still remember the supply people coming in the next morning and picking up their clothing and their blankets, and we saw 6 empty cots there. That shook us up.
The cots occupied by the Horner crew nearly became empty as well when one night training flight went particularly bad.
We were doing some night bombing at Muroc dry lake beds, and a sandstorm moved in and closed March, and we couldn't land. They told us to go to Palm Springs and make a landing, which was 70 or so miles away from March.
Jim turned around to me and said, "Tom, I need a heading to Palm Springs." And I thought, boy, I can't just off the top of my head give you a heading. First of all, I have to know where we are, and then I can get a heading from there. And so I thought, well, I can get a radio fix. And so I reached up and turned on the radio, and the needle on the radio compass dropped off.
The navigator says the compass was out. The radio operator says, I can't make contact. Everything was going wrong on that plane.
Scanning his radio frequencies, Lieutenant Horner was able to pick up a radio signal from a ground station that told him approximately where they were.
Jim was able to tune in and find one of these ground point zeros, I think they were called. And then I was able to get him a heading to Palm Springs.
But between them and Palm Springs were mountains, so the navigator's first instruction was to climb for altitude.
Well, we needed to, first of all, get up to a higher altitude to make sure that we were above the mountains.
In fact, the Palm Springs airport is nestled up against the mountains on its west side, which means that then, as well as now, the only safe way to approach Palm Springs for a landing is from an easterly direction. Landing patterns made from the east side keep a landing aircraft over relatively flat ground. Landing patterns made from the west, however, are extremely dangerous owing to the mountainous terrain. An airplane that attempts to land from this direction at night or under conditions of bad visibility is very likely to run into the mountain. Approaching the airport in the darkness and bouncing around in the rough air of the sandstorm, the cabin lights on their dilapidated bomber didn't work. Therefore, Lieutenants Horner and Cooper were forced to try to read their airport charts in the weak beam of a flashlight. They were able to make out the layout of the airport, but they missed the fact that the mountains were so close on the west side.
We didn't note in the airport directory that the traffic pattern was on one side of the field only, because the 11,000-foot mountain came up real close to the field. But we didn't know that because we were just in the dark, literally.
They made their landing pattern on the west side of the airfield and unknowingly let down over the mountains. Situations such as this are the reason that the wreckage of World War II training bombers litter the mountains of America to this day. In this case, however, luck was with the Horner crew. Somehow their bomber failed to hit the mountain in the darkness, and Lieutenant Horner was able to make a successful landing at the Palm Springs airport in the sandstorm. It wasn't until the crew got up in the morning in daylight and saw how closely the mountains crowded the airport on the west side that they realized, with a shock, just how close they had come to disaster during the landing.
After I got up the next morning, I looked out the window, and it looked like the mountain outside my window went right straight up from there. We were very close to the edge of the mountain.
We had noticed when we got up that this big mountain was right on one side of the field. During the night, when we landed, we must have almost rolled our wheels along this mountain. We didn't even know the mountain was there. Actually, I have no idea why we lived.
But their troubles weren't over yet. What they had not known during the night didn't hurt them. But on the takeoff from Palm Springs that morning, the worn-out old bomber refused to climb. They ended up just skimming across the ground, dangerously low, unable to rise. What was rising, however, was the boulder-strewn desert terrain beneath them. It was rising up to meet them, and it looked like another disaster in the making.
We took off, got up about 100 feet. The plane lost altitude, and couldn't figure out what was the matter. We kept adding power to the plane, and as you got away from the airport, the ground started rising, and it got closer and closer to the plane.
The ground came up as fast as we were trying to get up.
That plane could not get any lift.
And boulders about the size of houses were all over the place. And after 10 or 15 minutes, we hadn't gained any altitude, and every once in a while you'd fly over a boulder that was almost high enough to hit the bottom of the plane. And I frankly was looking for a place to crash it. But if I hit one of those boulders, we were sawdust.
It seemed like if we could have reached with our hand, we would have touched the boulders.
And so the bomber staggered full throttle across the desert floor while the pilots waited to see if it was going to sink down to disaster among the boulders or slowly climb to safety. Everyone in the crew realized that the next few minutes would decide whether they lived or died.
Oh, we were like they used to call it sweating it up. We were just wondering if it could make it or not.
It was a terrible experience. Finally, we gradually gained enough altitude that we were able to make a real shallow circle. And we circled in the valley shallow enough that we were gaining a few feet of altitude.
We were just hoping and praying that that plane could make it over the top of the mountain.
Eventually, we did get up and through the valley there and got back to March Field.
Somehow we managed to get that warped, twisted old plane back to March Field, but it didn't. It scared the heck out of all of us.
We got the plane up and managed to get back to March Field, and I red X'd the plane when we landed.
When a pilot red X'd a bomber, it was an official statement, on paper, that the aircraft was simply too dangerous to fly. The maintenance personnel at March Field were furious with Lieutenant Horner for sidelining one of their bombers, but he stuck to his guns. A red-X'd bomber could not be flown again until its deficiencies were fixed, and in this case they could not be fixed. The bomber was discovered to be bent, its wings twisted, and it ended up being junked.
We had a plane that should never have been flying.
There were some who claimed that a B-24, even a brand new one, was not as well built as a B-17, the other heavy bomber in the Air Corps' arsenal. The B-17, developed before the war, had been the product of a thorough program of research and development, whereas the B-24, the argument went, had been thrown together in haste under wartime pressures and was designed more for ease and speed of mass production than for strength. And the B-24's long, thin wing, which gave it a greater cruising speed than the B-17, just didn't look as strong as the B-17's wing. In fact, compared to the thick, beefy wing of the B-17, the B-24's wing looked downright fragile. It's a fact, though, that all American aircraft built during World War II were tough. But in the early part of the war, the B-17 had shown itself to be particularly tough. Although not even a B-17 could survive a wing or a tail shot completely off, as long as the main parts of the airframe hung together, a B-17 could absorb an astonishing amount of battle damage and still get back to base. In newsreels and in photographs in newspapers and magazines, everyone had seen B-17s with huge holes in them and large pieces blown off that still brought their crews home. And of the two bombers, there was no denying that the B-17 was much the better looking of the two. It was sleek and shapely, and along with its looks came an aura of glamour. Hollywood heartthrob Clark Gable had joined the Air Corps and was shown flying in B-17s. The famous actor Jimmy Stewart also joined the Air Corps and started out in B-17s. One of the first crews to complete 25 combat missions in Europe flew a B-17 named the Memphis Belle, and they toured the country promoting the sale of war bonds. Thus, when the American public thought of heavy bombers, they often thought first of the rugged, graceful B-17, as exemplified by the Memphis Belle.
The Flying Fortress. I remember we used to see pictures of them and just admire them. They were such a very well-built plane.
But the newer B-24 could fly faster and farther and carry a greater bomb load, so it was gradually replacing the B-17. By 1944, a young man who joined the Air Corps may have hoped that he would fly B-17s, but he nearly always ended up in a B-24.
When they assigned you to the 24, not too many people were happy. We didn't want to go to the Pacific. We didn't want to fly 24s.
Everybody liked the B-17. Why?
Well, because of the publicity. Our fortress, all the movie stars flew the B-17s. But then after you get assigned to the 24, and after you learn, and you see some of them come back all mangled and they still fly, and you look at those engines for 14 or 15 hours, they're ugly till it's your plane. They're not a good looking airplane. It was a boxcar. We call them Baker dash crashes. Pregnant cow or the Baker 2 dozen, they didn't say many good things about them, but you'd get in fights with people that run them down after you got used to them.
The 9-week combat crew training at March Field was complete by early May of 1944, and the crew was told that they'd soon be heading for the Pacific War Theater. No one was unhappy to say farewell to March Field and its worn-out, dangerous old training bombers. At Fairfield-Suisun Army Airfield near San Francisco, they were issued a shiny, brand-new bomber straight out of the nearby Consolidated Aircraft plant at San Diego.
And we picked up a brand new B-24. This is what we were to fly overseas.
They all had high hopes that this brand new airplane, perfect in every respect, would take them through the war and then bring them safely home again. They were told that they would soon be flying the airplane to Hawaii, the first leg on their journey to the South Pacific. While their bomber was being prepared for the long flight to Hawaii, the Horner crew got to spend a couple of days in San Francisco. On their last night in the States, the 4 officers of the crew, Lieutenants Horner, Cooper, Ostafon, and Theobald, attended a party. The Mark Hopkins Hotel on Nob Hill in San Francisco had, and still has, a glass-walled penthouse bar called the Top of the Mark Cocktail Lounge, which provides romantic views looking out over the Golden Gate Bridge in downtown San Francisco. Here many a farewell party was held during World War II, as servicemen bound for the Pacific War said goodbye to their wives and sweethearts, some of them forever.
And we were able to get into a private party on top of the Mark. And the Mark, that was the hotel in San Francisco. And I think there was probably a fair amount of drinking. And they got up on a little stage and did some dancing.
In the pre-dawn darkness of May 19, 1944, the 10 young men of the Horner crew climbed aboard their bomber and stowed away their personal effects, ready to face an uncertain future and whatever fate had in store for them in the World War. They took off from Fairfield-Suisun Army Airfield near Sacramento, and as dawn broke, they headed out over the Golden Gate Bridge toward the frighteningly empty Pacific Ocean.
I can remember going over the Golden Gate Bridge and thinking, well, this is your first big operation as a navigator. You really have a job cut out for you now to get them safely to Hawaii.
No one in the crew had ever flown over water before, so no one knew exactly what to expect.
The co-pilot was from California, so he had seen the ocean, but nobody had flown over the water before.
And adding to the sense of adventure, they were going it alone. No formation was flown to Hawaii, so not long after takeoff, they were in an empty sky except for themselves.
They were taking them off every 2 or 3 minutes, just one right after the other, And for the first half hour, you could see a plane here or a plane there. After the first half hour, you never saw another plane for 15 hours. They had navigation ships anchored in the Pacific, approximately 700 miles apart from San Francisco to Hawaii. We had a radio compass on the instrument panel, and you would shoot a fix on the CW beam that was coming out of the navigation ship, plot it on a chart, and then a half hour later you'd shoot the same navigation fix and plot that on the chart, and where they intersected, that was where you were.
Between Hawaii and San Francisco, there were radio ships where you could get a radio message. But I didn't want to depend on that. I wanted to depend on my ability as a navigator to get us safely to Hawaii. And as it ended up, I was able to do that. I think that Jim, the pilot, was kind of checking on me, but maybe he was tuning into some of these radio ships, but I didn't use them.
As hour after hour went by, and nothing but water could be seen out to the horizon in all directions, at least one crewman began to fear that he might never see land again.
Dale.
Sergeant
Man,
Dale?
He got panicky because hour after hour, nothing but water. And the poor guy, he kept looking. And of course, there was no land to look at. And I could tell he was really getting stressed. And finally, Horner says, "There's Hawaii up ahead." And all we could see was a little red line in the horizon because the land in Hawaii was all red volcanic. And this guy, he was jumping up and down with, he was convinced that we were going to go down in the water, I guess.
Everybody says we landed at Hickam Field. My memory says we landed at Rogers Field. Rogers Field is today the municipal airport of Honolulu.
Well, we got there late in the afternoon. We stayed there that night. The next day, they took us on this tour. And here was a field where all the bombers and fighters that the Japs had destroyed were all piled up. And we all stood there just shocked. And one guy, he kind of laughed. He said, well, he said, I think they're trying to let us know how bad things are going to be. And I'm pretty sure that's probably was the idea. And they also took us to a pineapple plantation, and at that plantation they had a fountain that instead of having water, it was pineapple juice.
We stayed there, if I recall, 2 nights, kind of getting our feet on the ground and getting the plane checked over and whatever. And then we took off southwest to Canton Island, which was basically a refueling stop. There wasn't much there other than maintenance hangars and gassing facilities.
But this time, unlike on the flight to Hawaii, there were no radio navigation ships to help them find their way to their destination. Finding tiny Canton Island in the middle of watery nowhere would be entirely up to their navigator, Tom Theobald. Only a few degrees of error in their compass heading would cause them to miss it, and if they failed to find the island, with their fuel critically low, the result would likely be fatal. Other crews had missed Canton Island and were never seen again. Earlier in the war, a B-17 carrying messages for General MacArthur in Australia missed Canton Island by 100 miles, and the crew was forced to ditch the airplane in the water after it ran out of fuel. Aboard that bomber was the famed race car driver and World War I pilot Eddie Rickenbacker. In an epic story of survival, Rickenbacker and 5 others managed to stay alive on a life raft for over 3 weeks before they were finally rescued. Fortunately for the Horner crew, their navigator, Lieutenant Tom Theobald, was equal to the challenge.
Tom Theobald gave me a compass heading from his map plots, and we had no trouble at all finding this little spot on the Pacific Ocean after flying 7 to 8 hours. Island probably about 2 miles long, almost entirely taken up by the landing strip and the gas tanks, refueling equipment. It's relatively smaller than a needle in a haystack.
This was a real test of navigation, but there again, I was able to get them there okay.
You wouldn't believe it, when we flew over it, we just couldn't, a little spit of land. That's all it was, a little atoll. I remember one of the guys saying, man, have we got a good navigator, that he could find this little spit of land out here. He was a fabulous navigator, boy, I'll tell you.
We landed there, spent the night. The next morning, we took off for the Fijis.
After an overnight stay at the Fiji Islands, the bomber was gassed up again, and the crew set out for New Caledonia. There they had their first problem. After refueling, they were taxiing back to the runway to take off, rolling along a narrow blacktop taxiway through a swamp, when the 30-ton bomber slipped off onto the soft gravel shoulder and one wheel sank deep into the mud. The wing on that side went almost down into the swampy water.
It had rained very heavily, and Horner must have gotten too close to the edge, and we got caught into that red mud, and the next thing you know, the plane was at an angle like this.
One of the wheels of the B-24 got off the taxiway, and we had a devil of a time.
We taxied out, and it had been a fighter base, and the taxiways were probably 15, 18 feet wide through the jungle, almost like bicycle paths. Well, the B-24's gear is 13, 14 feet apart, so you don't have much room on each side of the plane for the tires to stay out of the shoulder. And I'm going a little bit too fast for the winding trail, and I get a wheel off the pavement, off the blacktop, into the gravel. And the minute the wheel hit the gravel, we're carrying something like 34, 35 tons of weight, and there's 3 tons of fuel in each wing. And as soon as that wheel hit the soft gravel, the plane sunk in, and the wing goes down, almost touching the water in the swamp.
And they had to call a bulldozer to pull us out.
That put us a day behind because we had to take the plane back, and Cooper got the maintenance chief to wash the mud off and go over the plane and see if we had pulled anything out of kilter or warped the gear in any way.
Cooper told the ground crew, now we want you to check it out and make sure the plane's okay. And one of them, I said, there's nothing wrong with it. You just guys take off. And old Cooper told him, yes, you guys don't have to fly these planes. We do. We want this checked out.
Lieutenant Cooper was well aware that an airplane could easily get bent while being hauled out of the mud by a bulldozer, and he wanted the airplane checked for damage. The inspection caused some delay, and the crew had to spend another night at New Caledonia, but the next day they were off and on their way to the continent of Australia, landing at Townsville.
And Townsville at that time was a little dusty, almost a frontier town where the Australians raised sheep and all that.
When they reached Australia, they had flown over 7,600 miles from San Francisco. Now there was less than 700 miles to go to get into the hot part of the war zone at Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea. But at Townsville, the crew experienced a major disappointment. They were told that they would not be able to keep the shiny new bomber that they had been issued at San Francisco.
And that's where we found out, to our distress, that that plane was not going to be our plane. We were just flying it over. What a disillusion it was for us, because we got this brand new plane out of San Francisco, and we had already begun to make because they didn't make any allowance for the needs that we had. So we had built like little urinals with a little holes outside. I said, well, this is going to be our plane. We get there to Townsville. I said, oh no, you were just flying it over. It's you'll get when you go to New Guinea, you'll get planes up there, beat up planes too. We were just so disillusioned at that, but that's the way it was.
We had assumed that was our airplane, and we were going to take it overseas, going to keep it. And we started coming up with names. One of the names was the Fertile Turtle.
But the Fertile Turtle, or whatever name they would have settled on, was not to be theirs. They had hoped to fly this one B-24 throughout their combat tour and then bring it triumphantly home, as the crew of the Memphis Belle had done with their B-17 from Europe. Lieutenant Horner had told his crew that they might even celebrate their homecoming by flying the bomber underneath the Golden Gate Bridge at San Francisco.
He says, when we come back, I'm going to fly this thing under the Bay Bridge. And of course, we all thought it was going to be that way, you know. How foolish we were.
Instead, they were told that they had just ferried the bomber over into the war zone, and that when they got into combat, they would be issued any bomber that was available on the day of a mission. When they last saw their bomber at Townsville, it was having all of the factory-installed armor for the crew stripped out of it to make it lighter so that it could carry more gasoline and bombs on the long-distance missions of the South Pacific.
It seemed like we hadn't any more than landed, but they started to take off some of the weight of the plane and lighten up the plane so we could carry more bombs.
They took out all the armor that was supposed to protect us against anti-aircraft.
The gunners in the back had a plate in front of their window, and the The pilot and co-pilot had 5/8 armor, steel, mummy cases. They come up the side of your seat and go over your shoulders and then in and up over your head so that you look like you were laying in a mummy case. If you pull back inside that, you were almost enclosed in 5/8 armor plate. And the navigator and the bombardier had armor in the floor.
They stripped that plane of everything that they could possibly do because they knew out there we had to fly those 14-hour missions loaded with gasoline and bombs. So they stripped away everything that they could do to save weight.
3,500 pounds of this steel, and they piled all of this armor in a great big pile, no telling how much it cost the government to put it in. And our planes then were lighter. They could carry 4 or 5 more bombs or 600 more gallons of gas.
The crew decided that this was a typical case of government inefficiency, having them fly all of that heavy armor plating all the way across the Pacific Ocean, only to have it stripped out and thrown into a junk pile when they reached Australia. The next step for the Horner crew, after they lost what they had hoped would be their own personal bomber, was to get up to Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea, where the war was in progress. They were given a different bomber, one that already had all the armor stripped out of it, and were told to deliver it and themselves to Port Moresby. They took aboard some hitchhikers, 2 Army nurses, and a fighter plane pilot who also wanted to get up to Port Moresby and set off across the Coral Sea. The trip was expected to take about 6 hours. Their destination, Jackson Airfield, which is still in use today, is located on the east side of the town, 7 miles from the harbor, hence its other name, 7 Mile Field. Lieutenant Horner's instructions were to fly a heading to Port Moresby and then run eastward along the coast until he spotted a sunken ship. There he would turn back on a northerly course and follow a river up to Jackson Field. It should have been a simple task, but as so often happened in New Guinea, the weather interfered.
As we got closer to New Guinea, the weather was extremely poor.
The cloud cover sank down until it was just barely above the surface of the water, and there was heavy rain.
We run into bad weather, and the ceiling starts dropping, and we're dropping, and we get pushed down to 50, 100 feet into the water, and the water is squirting through the glass windows and the windshield, down into the radio, and the radio's acting up. And we find the coast, and we follow the coastline of New Guinea eastward till we find these sunken ships in the mouth of the river. Then we turn to a compass heading upriver. We're going to go the 7 or 8 miles up there, and we should be able to land at Jackson Strip. As we go upriver, the ceiling stays the same, but the land rises up underneath you, and pretty soon we're down to about 50 feet, and we're running with flaps partially down and gear down, and we know that when we see the runway, we're going to have to set it down in a hurry, but we don't see the runway in time to get over on it. So I pull the plane up in a shallow bank and start turning to go back down to the ocean and do this whole thing all over again. And I complete the shallow turn to see branches passing the wingtips, and I know I'm right in the top of the trees.
Almost scraping the tops of the jungle trees, Lieutenant Horner took the bomber back to the ocean to turn around and make another run up the river and another attempt to land. The airfield ahead of him, Jackson Airdrome, had been improved by laying down over it a thin layer of perforated sheet metal known as Marsden matting. A Marsden mat airfield was smooth and free of mud, but it was also very slippery in rain. As Lieutenant Horner came back up the river on his second landing attempt, once again flying just below the clouds and almost scraping the treetops, he was careful this time to line up with where he knew the end of the runway would be, and when it came into view again through the rain and fog, he was able to set the big bomber down on the Marsden mat surface. But there was another problem. A C-47 cargo plane was also touching down not very far ahead of them. It looked like there might be a collision.
All of a sudden, we see this Goonie bird, C-47. He's just about touching down, and he's a quarter mile in front of us. We're going to plow into him. Well, the tower starts calling him to pick up his tail and run because there's a B-24 behind him. And we've got all the flaps down and we've got the throttles all chopped. And he picks up his tail and pours coal to it. He gets semi-airborne. We hit the runway and I stand on the brakes and lock up both wheels. And I slide down the runway probably a half mile because this steel mat in that rain is just slippery. And we get the plane stopped, and I've got 20-inch flats ground on both tires where the wheels had been locked.
There was a darn C-47 in front of him that shouldn't have been there. And he says, I jammed on those brakes and we slid. And he says, all the rubber on the tires was burnt off. And we didn't know that. We were in the back.
But about that time, a chief comes out, got a couple of guys in it. One's a captain, one's a major. And these guys rush up and they grab your hand. They can't believe that you got in there. He says, you're the second B-24 that's landed, and the other one landed early this morning. And they take you up to the tower, and it's full of grass. There's a couple of colonels and a general there, and everybody's want to shake your hand, and they couldn't believe that anybody could land in that, because everybody else was flying around and around up in the clouds until they ran out of gas, and then some of them were jumping, and even the general had to bail out.
Jim had a very tough time getting the plane down and getting it down safely. And as it turned out, we were one of the few that did make it through to Port Moresby.
The crew settled into tent quarters at Port Moresby for a temporary stay. In the days that followed, they took practice flights in the Port Moresby area to gain some familiarity with New Guinea's terrain and climate. And, like all other Americans in the Southwest Pacific, they found the living conditions left a lot to be desired. Americans before World War II knew little about conditions in the South Pacific. Pictures in National Geographic magazine or the Bob Hope Bing Crosby road movies, which featured the actress Dorothy Lamour as a lovely native of the jungles, had many Americans believing that it was a paradise, a land where palm trees swayed gently in the trade breezes of beautiful sandy beaches. When American servicemen arrived in the area, all such illusions were quickly shattered by the harsh realities of life in the tropics. Behind the picture postcard scenery, the jungles on the Pacific Islands were hellholes of blistering heat and humidity, where incessant rains drenched landscapes as rugged as any on Earth, creating endless tracts of mud and rotting vegetation, and where it was sometimes impossible to get dry. Metal rusted, clothing rotted away, and fungus attacked human skin. Swarms of mosquitoes and other insects carried malaria and numerous other tropical diseases, and the jungles were inhabited by Stone Age native tribes that practiced headhunting and cannibalism. 15-foot-long pythons and deadly cobras slithered into their tents, and bats as large as buzzards circulated under the jungle canopy. The many streams, rivers, and swamps were infested with crocodiles and blood-sucking leeches. The surrounding oceans were filled with sharks, and anyone who had hoped that the native women would look like Dorothy Lamour were sadly disappointed. Whenever the real ladies of the jungle were encountered, not only did they not look much like Dorothy Lamour, but some of them considered white men to be menu items. All of these hardships and disappointments could be borne by the young men of America's armed forces. But one thing that they could not shrug off was disease. When they got to Port Moresby, the members of the Horner crew, like nearly all other Americans in the Pacific, started coming down with tropical diseases.
Everybody immediately got, we call it the GIs, which was diarrhea. And of course, there again, we had no place to wash our hands or anything.
For every 2 men who were lost to combat, 5 men were lost to disease. Malaria was the most common malady, but the long list of diseases included cholera, beriberi, scrub typhus, dysentery, hepatitis, tropical ulcers, jungle rot,
Black water fever, dengue fever, yellow jaundice. Of course, I had malaria all the time I was there, but you took Atobrin, and that kind of suppressed it. And oh my goodness, the doctors used to tell us we're diseases here we never even knew existed.
And on top of the harsh realities of the Pacific environment, the jungles were filled with the Japanese invaders. Ruthless, fanatical, and suicidal fighters, they almost never surrendered and had to be dug out of their concealed positions in caves and bunkers and destroyed. It was hard, dangerous, brutal, dirty work, and many young American lives were lost in the process. But that was the job of the infantry. The men of the U.S. Army Air Corps had their own dangers to face, but at least their living conditions were somewhat better than the foot soldiers. The flyers, the aircraft mechanics, and other support personnel lived in tent encampments beside the airfields, and the airfields were typically some distance back from the fighting front. However, the American airfields were frequently bombed by the Japanese, despite the best efforts of the anti-aircraft guns that were set up around the airfields, and American fighter planes, which attempted to intercept the Japanese attackers and drive them away or shoot them down. And even in the tent towns, there was no escaping the 100-plus degree temperatures, the steaming humidity, the jungle diseases, the bad food, and rains that sometimes seemed to go on forever, so that everything had to be done in mud. By the time the Horner crew joined the war in the Southwest Pacific in May of 1944, the Japanese were on the defensive. Japanese conquests had reached their greatest extent in 1942, and now they were being driven back. Japan had begun building its empire well before World War II. Korea was annexed in the early part of the 20th century, and the Japanese invaded Manchuria in the 1930s. They were soon invading the rest of China, and after their sneak attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, they went on a rampage of conquest throughout the South Pacific. The British surrendered their army at Singapore in February of 1942, and the Japanese had soon taken most of New Guinea and the surrounding island chains. They began bombing the cities of northern Australia, obviously preparing for an invasion there too. The man who was placed in charge of Allied resistance to the Japanese was the American General Douglas MacArthur. He had been in charge of American forces in the Philippines, and when the American army there was overwhelmed, he escaped to Australia in a B-17 on orders of President Roosevelt. After he reached Australia, he issued his famous promise to the Filipinos, "I shall return." And from that point onward, he was obsessed with retaking the Philippines and then carrying the war to Japan itself. MacArthur's strategy, which was hampered by a lack of men and materiel, owing to the Allies' Europe First policy, was to advance along the northern coast of New Guinea, building airfields as he went, so that American bombers could reach first the Philippines and then Japan itself. At the same time, the American Navy and Marines, under the command of Admiral Chester Nimitz, would take a more direct route toward Japan, working their way up the smaller island chains. This was the campaign that resulted in the famous bloody island battles, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and others. And the strategy was the same, to capture islands to build airfields on, so that the bombers could reach ever further north until they finally could bomb Japan. Because air power, after all, was the deciding factor in World War II. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese conquest of New Guinea was almost complete. Only the Australian outpost of Port Moresby still held out. The Japanese High Command planned a two-pronged attack to take Port Moresby. From the village of Buna on the north coast, a Japanese army of several thousand men moved southward along a jungle trail known as the Kokoda Track to attack Port Moresby from the landward side. At the same time, the Japanese Navy sent an invasion fleet through the Coral Sea to attack Port Moresby from the seaward side. The Japanese were confident that Port Moresby, caught between these two forces, would surrender as easily as Singapore had done a few months earlier. This would complete the Japanese conquest of New Guinea, and Port Moresby would then become a base from which the Japanese could launch attacks on the mainland of Australia. But Port Moresby would not be another Singapore. As the Japanese army advanced down the Kokoda Trail, it first encountered a small Australian militia force. In several hard-fought battles, it managed to push the Australians all the way back to within sight of Port Moresby. But there the Australians received reinforcements, and the tide turned. In 4 months of savage jungle fighting, from August to November of 1942, the Australians pushed the Japanese all the way back to Buna. The Kokoda Trail was a mountainous tropical hell, and the nightmarish combat there has been called by some historians the toughest fighting in the world. The second prong of the Japanese assault, the naval landing force headed for Port Moresby, was intercepted by the American Navy and defeated in the Battle of the Coral Sea. For the first time in a major sea battle, the opposing ships never even sighted each other. The attacks on the ships were carried out entirely by the warplanes based on their aircraft carriers, demonstrating yet again the primacy of air power in the war. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, in May of 1942, Port Moresby was safe from invasion, even though it was still being bombed day and night by the Japanese Air Force. From this time on, the Japanese forces were always on the defensive. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had sown the wind, and soon they would reap the whirlwind. Now American troops were arriving in Australia, and General MacArthur sent the U.S. 32nd Division to join the Australians at Buna. Together, between November of 1942 and January of 1943, the Americans and Australians destroyed the Japanese forces at Buna. But the cost was so high, nearly 2,000 Allied soldiers killed and over 14,000 wounded or disabled by sickness, that General MacArthur vowed never again to attack well-prepared Japanese dug-in positions head-on. From this time forward he would, as he put it, hit 'em where they ain't, bypassing and isolating strong Japanese garrisons, cutting off their supplies, and, as he said, letting them wither on the vine. Following this strategy, he advanced northward up the northern coast of New Guinea, finding and seizing suitable locations to build air bases, because the heavy bombers of the 5th Air Force, the B-17s and B-24s, were his primary offensive weapons. After taking Buna, he set his sights next on Nadzab, a Japanese airfield in the valley of the Markham River. On the 5th of September, 1943, he sent in American paratroopers, the 503rd Airborne Infantry. Operating behind a smokescreen laid down by medium bombers, the paratroopers quickly drove off the surprised Japanese defenders. American engineers then went to work and rapidly converted the small Japanese airfield into a large American airbase that could handle the 5th Air Force's heavy bombers. A sizable tent city soon sprang up beside the airfield to accommodate the aviators and their support personnel. Bombers based at Port Moresby and now at Nadzab hammered Japanese strongholds all over New Guinea and the surrounding islands. As General MacArthur's offensive gained momentum, he picked new locations for air bases further up the coast, places where the Japanese already had airfields that he knew were not strongly defended. By now it was the spring of 1944. On the 22nd of April, the Americans took Hollandia and Idape. On the 17th of May, they landed at Maffin Bay, and on the 27th of May, the Americans assaulted Biak Island. Each one of these landings was made by elements of the U.S. Army, supported by the Navy and the 5th Air Force. The Navy bombarded the shoreline before the landing craft went in, and the 5th Air Force's bombers and fighters provided air cover. As soon as the target area was secured, construction of the airfield was immediately begun, sometimes under the eyes of General MacArthur himself. At Maffin Bay, the objective was to seize a small island offshore called Watki Island and to convert the Japanese airfield there into an American heavy bomber base. After all these locations had been captured, General MacArthur had heavy bomber bases at Port Moresby, Nadzab, Wakti Island, and Biak Island. The Horner crew would see all of them.
From Port Moresby, we went to Nadzab, and there we joined the 90th Bomb Group, which identified itself as the best damn heavy bomb group in the world.
The 90th Bomb Group was known as the Jolly Rogers. The name Jolly Rogers came about after Colonel Arthur H. Rogers assumed command of the 90th Bomb Group in July of 1943. Colonel Rogers was an aggressive commander who personally led the 90th on many of its combat missions. One of his favorite targets was Japanese transport shipping, and it was said that he prowled the sea lanes looking for ships to prey on like an old-time pirate. Someone remembered that the traditional pirate flag, the skull with crossed bones, was known as the Jolly Roger, and the 90th Bomb Group of the 5th Air Force, led by Colonel Rogers, soon became known as the Jolly Rogers. They adopted the pirate emblem, but they changed the crossed bones into crossed bombs. An artist in the group made a large aluminum stencil that they used to paint the symbol on the tails of all their bombers. This caught the attention of the press and the public, and was the beginning of the 90th Bomb Group's rise to fame. They would become the best-known heavy bomb group of the Pacific War. The large skull and cross-bomb symbol on their tails also made the 90th bombers very easy to recognize in the air. The 90th Bomb Group was comprised of 4 squadrons: the 319th, the 320th, the 321st, and the 400th. Each squadron had its own nickname and its own symbol. The symbols were often worn as jacket patches by the crewmen. Since the Pacific Theater was allotted less than 10% of America's industrial war output, each of the 4 squadrons of the 90th Bomb Group only had about 6 bombers on hand at any given time, for a total of 24 bombers for the entire group. This was only a fraction of the size of a bomb group in the European war theater. So while a large-scale bombing effort in the Pacific might employ dozens of bombers, in Europe 1,000 bombers might go to a large target such as Berlin. The 5th Air Force in the Pacific was the poor relation of the 8th Air Force in Europe, and it operated on a comparative shoestring.
We had 4 squadrons. The ideal was that every squadron should have 6 planes ready to fly, but it never happened. Planes weren't available, they were being worked on, crews were not complete. We were lucky most of the time if we would get, instead of 24 planes, which was the ideal, we were lucky if we would get 15 or 16 planes up, and some days even less.
When the Horner crew joined the 90th Bomb Group, they were assigned to its 320th Squadron. It was nicknamed the Moby Dick Squadron.
Our squadron strength had 4 airplanes on many missions. In Europe, it would be 16 to more for a squadron. And we would fly 1 flight of 4, they would fly 4 flights of 4 as a squadron strength.
The ferocious whale named Moby Dick in the Herman Melville novel grew large teeth on the Moby Dick Squadron emblem, which soon adorned the noses of many of its bombers. Before long, any airfield occupied by the 320th had B-24s grinning wickedly from their revetments. The intention was to strike fear into the hearts of enemy fighter plane pilots, and it probably did. But the crew of a bomber named Moby Dick didn't stop with painting teeth on their own airplane. They decided that the squadron's little Piper Cub liaison airplane should become Moby Dick Jr., and they painted teeth on it too. But it's hard to make a Piper Cub look very fierce, and the little airplane ended up looking rather like it was eating its own engine. But at least it looked a little more as though it belonged among its big brothers on the airfield. The commander of the 90th Bomb Group in 1943, Colonel Art Rogers, in addition to being an inspirational combat leader, was an innovator and experimenter with his aircraft. He saw ways to improve the B-24 bomber. Early versions of the B-24 had no gun turret on the nose. Instead, it had individual machine guns on swivel mounts firing through the plexiglass windows. These single guns were awkward and difficult to bring to bear on enemy fighter planes. By contrast, the hydraulically powered turret on the tail was quick to aim, and the twin 50 caliber machine guns packed a tremendous punch. Japanese fighter plane pilots had recognized the weaker firepower in the nose and were attacking the B-24s from the front. To remedy this, Colonel Rogers decided that the nose of the B-24 should have the same firepower as the tail. He removed the tail turret from a wrecked B-24 and devised a way to mount it on the nose of the bomber that he flew most often, which was nicknamed the Connell Special, named for General Carl Connell, who approved the project. After the turret was mounted on the nose, B-24 crewmen from all over the Port Moresby airfield gathered to examine it. The news spread like wildfire, Colonel Rogers wrote, and from the crowd that gathered, one would have thought that none of these men had ever seen an airplane before. This is easy to explain, he said, when you consider that these men's lives were at stake, and with anything that might give them an added chance, they were vitally interested in its possibilities. Not only did the new nose turret increase the B-24's forward firepower, but it made it balance better fore and aft, which increased its flying speed. Next, Colonel Rogers had all the camouflage paint stripped off of the airplane, removing several hundred pounds of weight, and the lightened bomber flew even better. The factories that made the B-24 adopted the modifications, and that is why the new bomber that the Horner crew flew out from San Francisco had a nose turret and no camouflage paint. At Nadzab, two members of the Horner crew, the co-pilot Lieutenant Cooper and the bombardier Lieutenant Ostafan, were sent out on missions with experienced crews to see what combat missions were like and to gain a little experience themselves. Lieutenant Cooper's experience was nearly disastrous. A Japanese anti-aircraft cannon shell passed through the cockpit without exploding and missed him by inches.
They say it came up between his legs. I heard that it took off part of his pant leg. And then they went out near his head and lifted a hole that big. It could have been his head, you know. And that's why the poor guy was just scared out of his wits.
When they heard about it, other members of the crew saw morbid humor in this incident, but for Lieutenant Cooper, this close brush with death was something that he could never quite shake off. From Nadzab, the Horner crew next moved to Wakti Island to begin flying missions as a crew.
A short time later, just several days, we moved up to a small island called Wakti, and it was right off the coast of New Guinea.
But Wakti Island was within range of Japanese bombers, and it was being bombed every day, mostly at night.
We got there, it was late in the afternoon, and right away they told us this place is under bombardment every night. And that night they told us, you use that tent, so the 10 of us, so our cots were right next to one another. Of course, we didn't take our clothes off because they said the bombing raids begin sometimes without warning. There was a discussion, should we take our shoes off? And all of us decided, no, we're going to sleep with our shoes. And Horner said, oh, I'm sure that when the alarm comes, we have time to put on our shoes. Well, that night when we woke up, the bombs were falling all over the place. And we all ran out. And I remember poor old Horner, my shoes, I can't find my shoes. And I still remember Osthoff, the bombardier, that'll teach you, silly ass, to take off your shoes.
All I wanted to do was to get to that slit trench. But the first ones in are the ones that are hurt because everybody falls on top.
Everybody falls on top of them.
After that first night, the crew split into 2 separate tents in 2 separate areas, following the Army's normal practice of separating officers from enlisted men. The 4 lieutenants got one tent, and the 6 sergeants got another. Living conditions were cramped in either case.
The 6 enlisted men, we lived in one tent, and it was very crowded because those tents were like about 10 by 10, and it just barely, we would, for the 6 cots, they were all around the, the inside of the tent. Now the officers had the same size tent, but there was 4 of them, so they had a little more room.
Living on a seashore was a new experience for the young men, and the youngest, Carter, somehow got the idea that a rising tide may not stop. He feared that it might continue to rise during the night and drown them all in their cots.
These were guys that had never lived around the ocean, and this was all new to them. And one night when there was a heavy rainstorm, he woke us up and said, "The tide has come in."
But there we started flying bombing missions. Most of them out of there were just along the coast of New Guinea.
The crew's first combat mission in the first week of June 1944 was to bomb a Japanese airfield at Baca. They were in a formation of 9 B-24s. As they neared the target, anti-aircraft fire began coming up from the ground. Most of the crew had never seen it before.
It would be a black puff, as anti-aircraft shells would explode. It was a black puff of smoke.
Reactions to this first anti-aircraft cannon fire varied.
This other waist gunner, when he saw those black bursts, he was scared out of his wits, and he was hanging onto my shoulders. That was Dale, and I yelled at him, "Get back to your gun!"
Lieutenant Cooper, the co-pilot, seeing the black bursts in the sky around them, experienced a similar reaction, remembering how a Japanese shell had passed through the cockpit within inches of him on his previous orientation flight.
Cooper would scoot way down and put his head between his legs. Porter would get pretty angry at him. "Get up," he says. "You're the co-pilot."
On that first mission to Baca, they caught the Japanese by surprise with their airplanes on the ground. Several Japanese aircraft were wrecked, and the runway was cratered. But the Japanese continued to hit back, although not as effectively. Japan had no 4-engine heavy bombers comparable to the American B-24. But at least one of their twin-engine medium bombers came over the American airfield on Wakti Island every night, hoping to avoid American anti-aircraft gunners and fighter planes in the dark. These nighttime raids also deprived the Americans of sleep, since they had to jump for cover during every bombing, and the cover didn't always work.
We got bombed, and these 5 mechanics that were working on planes, they jumped into this crater that had been made from the previous bombs. But lo and behold, on that day, a bomb hit them in the crater and blew all 5 of them up. They were the burial detail, they call them. He said, "My God," he said, "we picked up little bones here, little pieces there."
The small island was jammed with American airplanes, and the bombs frequently hit them as well.
There's 2 or 3 B-24s, and it says hit directly, direct hit, and all, it was just a pile of junk.
The island was packed. There were tents, supplies, you name it. The Japs, no matter at night what part of the island they hit, they would hit. I remember one night they hit our fuel dump, and it just went up in a flash. And we were without gasoline for about 2 or 3 days till new supplies came in.
But they endured the nightly bombings and continued to fly their missions, flying 2 or 3 missions each week. But the island's airfield was so short and the bombers so heavily loaded that every takeoff was a dangerous adventure. On one day when 37 bombers were assigned to a mission, 4 of them ran out of runway before they could lift off. They crashed into the sea and exploded, killing their crews. 40 young men were dead before the mission had even begun.
The airstrip took up the full length of the island.
The runaway ran from one end to the other.
We had to get that plane off the ground. You had to horse it off the ground before you would like to, and every plane is different. Some planes would be 3, 4, 5 miles an hour difference. It can be 200 or 300 feet of runway. There's a considerable difference in individual airplanes.
We used to have an expression, we sweated it up, because the runaway was the length of the island. It was a small island, and these planes overloaded with gasoline and bombs. We knew we were coming to the end of the runaway, and that plane was still not off the ground. And then just as we got to the end, you could feel, I think the wheels almost touched the water sometime. But I tell you, it was a very worrisome thing.
Knowing that air power was the key to dominating the Southwest Pacific, General MacArthur kept his heavy bombers, which were all B-24s by this time, relentlessly and repeatedly hammering Japanese airfields throughout the region.
Most of the stuff that we bombed were Japanese airfields because that was the big military item.
We mostly bombed airstrips, and this was to keep the Japanese fighters and their bombers unable to take off and attack us.
The Japanese had established many airfields along the coast of New Guinea and surrounding islands. The American strategy to take them out was to have the large bombers, the B-24s, operating at altitudes up to 10,000 feet, drop large, high-explosive bombs on the runways to make them unusable for takeoffs or landings. Meanwhile, smaller American aircraft staged lightning raids at low altitude.
Medium and light bombers and the P-38s would go in and take care of the airplane. They'd strafe them.
These daring and dangerous low-level strafing raids caught Japanese aircraft on the ground, as well as blowing up fuel, ammunition dumps, and ground defenses. The main American medium bomber was the B-25, made by the North American company and called the Mitchell. It was a twin-tailed, twin-engine bomber with a top speed of 270 miles per hour. It carried a crew of 4, compared to the B-24's crew of 10. The 5th Air Force also had the A-20, a light attack bomber made by the Douglas Corporation and nicknamed the Havoc. The A-20 could be flown by a crew of 2, the pilot and a gunner. The man in charge of the 5th Air Force under General MacArthur was General George Kenney. General Kenney had his medium bombers modified for their strafing role by replacing their plexiglass nose canopies with banks of machine guns and cannon. They proved to be devastatingly effective against Japanese ground installations and shipping. The planes often flew at treetop height, or in the case of ships, at mast height. And in addition to destroying hundreds of Japanese airplanes that they caught on the ground, they also sank a significant number of the enemy's transport vessels and small warships. But operating at very low altitudes was dangerous work. They had to rely on their speed as their main defense against Japanese anti-aircraft guns. It wasn't always successful. In this sequence of photos, an A-20 has been hit by ground fire as it passed over a Japanese airfield and crashes into the sea, killing its 2 crewmen. It was an all too common occurrence. Another hazard of low-level attacks was that the bombers could run into each other's bomb blasts. Another sequence of photos shows B-25s attacking Japanese supply ships. The last plane in the formation runs into a waterspout thrown up by a previous plane's bomb. And with half of one wing blown off, it cartwheels into the sea, and 4 crewmen die. General Kenney sought a solution to this problem, and he finally came up with one. He had parachutes attached to the bombs, and by the time they drifted down to the ground and exploded, the bombers were well out of the way. The automatic tail camera of a B-25 captured this image of a parked Japanese bomber just a few seconds before it was blown to bits by parachute bombs. The low-altitude hit-and-run tactics by twin-engine American light and medium bombers tore up Japanese airfields and installations all across the Southwest Pacific. But it was the B-24 heavy bombers flying higher and dropping greater quantities of much heavier bombs that could do the most damage to the enemy.
The heavy bombers, they used us to take out permanently the airfield itself and the hangars and the harbor facilities, because we could put stuff out of business for a long time.
Nothing could blow as big a hole in the runway of a Japanese airfield as a 1,000 or 2,000-pound bomb, and these could only be carried in quantity by the B-24s. A B-24 could carry 8 1,000-pound bombs, or 4 2,000-pounders. 4 tons of high explosives. On one mission that the Horner crew flew against a Japanese airfield, the bombs failed to drop in train, or one by one, so Lieutenant Ostaphan, the bombardier, quickly hit the salvo button to dump them all at once.
As quick as he can reflex, he hits the salvo. Well, all of these bombs, 8,000 pounds of them, hit dead center in the runway. So we got 100% of 2,000 pounders, 8,000 pounds of bombs in one hole. Oh, it was unbelievable. And Captain Smith, the intelligence officer, looked at it and he says, "Holy smokes." He said, "They could drop a hangar in this." And it was 200 feet across and 90 feet deep.
That's a big hole.
That's a big hole. And he says, "They won't fill this one up in a hurry."
On most bombing missions, the leading bomber in a formation carried what was called the lead bombardier, usually a man chosen for his skill and accuracy at bombing. The bombardiers on all the other bombers kept their eyes on his aircraft, and when he let his bombs go, so did they. On one of the missions in which the Horner crew participated, the lead bombardier was not satisfied with his first bomb run, so he held his bombs and led the entire formation around in a big circle to make a second bomb run. This gave the Japanese on the airfield below time to begin sending up their fighter planes, and that caused everyone some anxious moments.
Planes were coming up just like mosquitoes, and he doesn't drop. And going around, boy, I heard everybody was screaming, "What, don't remember this guy? He's going to get us killed. These guys are coming up and he wants to do it again."
Like I told you, we almost lynched that guy when we got on the ground.
And we were afraid that he'd go around the third time. But everybody was scared to death that they were going to just swarm all over us.
But I always remember Ostaphan, when he was the lead bombardier, he would drop the bombs the first time over, and I could always hear his word, "Let's get the hell out of here," he would say. By that time, the anti-aircraft was really pounding away.
In general, Japanese anti-aircraft guns were not as numerous nor as accurate as their counterparts in Europe. Over Germany, American bombers typically flew from 20 to 30,000 feet high. An Air Corps training film shows how flak was less accurate at high altitudes. But the Germans had many flak guns, and they could fill the sky with shell bursts at almost any altitude. Above 10,000 feet, oxygen masks were mandatory, and at 30,000 feet, the air temperature could be as low as 60 degrees below zero. Any exposed skin was threatened with frostbite. In the Pacific, however, where the anti-aircraft guns were usually fewer and less accurate, the bombers could fly at 10,000 feet or less, where oxygen was not required, the cold was merely uncomfortable and not life-threatening, and bombing accuracy was greatly increased.
The guns on the ground in the Pacific were all plotted. They didn't just have them one gun after the other. There'd be a gun plotted over here, and then 40 acres over here would be another gun, and we knew where they all were. So we would try to stay away from the guns That was part of our morning briefing. The intelligence officer would be up there with a big chart, and he'd have every gun around the target was plotted, and then your IP was here, and you were going to miss these guns. So come through here.
But despite all attempts to avoid it, when they were over their targets, the bombers still often found themselves surrounded by the black bursts of anti-aircraft shells. A direct hit by a shell could be fatal, as seen in this dramatic footage of a B-24 that was hit in the wing root. The wing folds, the fuel ignites, and the bomber goes down in flames. Only one member of the crew survived. Much more common than a direct hit was for a bomber to be struck by the spray of shrapnel, described by one crewman as sounding like a handful of gravel thrown against a tin roof. Sergeant Baca was hit by a piece of metal one day while standing at his waist gun window.
As we were flying over the targets, we would stand by our guns ready in case any aircraft came at us. And of course, we'd be seeing the puffs of the anti-aircraft fire all around us all the time. And that one time that I got hit, I was very taken back. It was just like a little cut on the forehead. I felt it when it hit me. I felt the sting. And I was very, very surprised.
That should have been reported. He should have got a Purple Heart for it. I didn't know anything about it.
I never told him or anybody else. I just thank God that that little piece of shrapnel didn't do any more harm. It could have gone through my brain.
Bullets from Japanese fighter planes were another deadly hazard, as witnessed one day by Lieutenant Theobald.
There was a B-24 that landed from some other group than ours, and I noticed they took somebody off head first in a stretcher, and come to find out it was the navigator, and the navigator had been killed. And what had happened was that he was standing between the pilot and the co-pilot, and he was hit in the head with a shell from a fighter plane. And so I was thinking, I am not going to be standing up between the pilot and the co-pilot.
In September of 1944, after flying missions from Wakti Island for 3 months, the Horner crew moved up to Baca Island. The 90th Bomb Group, the Jolly Rogers, would operate from Baca Island for the next 5 months. The battle to capture Baca Island was barely over when the Jolly Rogers arrived there. There were still hundreds of Japanese soldiers hiding out in caves near the airfields, and although the Army established a perimeter to keep them out of the camp, some still managed to slip in at night to attack the Americans or to steal food and supplies.
A Japanese soldier came in at night with a knife. He cut a rip in his tent and threw in a hand grenade, but luckily the hand grenade didn't go off. There was all kinds of caves on Baca. It was mostly limestone. In one of those caves, a group of Japanese soldiers went in there, and right behind our camp was this cave, and they brought artillery there, and for 3 days and 3 nights they were pounding the entrance to that cave. Of course, we didn't get any sleep with the artillery. And suddenly one night we heard the rattle of machine guns, and they say all of them came rushing out of the cave at night.
One of them at night came down and tried to get into the eating tent, and he was captured.
The Japanese soldier captured in the 90th Bomb Group camp area on Baca on November 12, 1944, was starving and dressed in rags. He was given food, clothing, and medical attention, interrogated, and then evacuated to a prisoner of war camp. But while he was in the 90th Bomb Group's camp, he was a great curiosity. Most Japanese soldiers preferred death to capture, and very few prisoners were ever seen.
Oh, he looked horrible. Most of us had never seen a Japanese.
I don't know what they did with him. We didn't shoot captives like the Japs did.
The Japanese tortured, murdered, or enslaved their captives, so Japanese who fell into American hands were surprised to be treated humanely, and they were returned to Japan after the war. A photograph of the Horner crew taken on Baca Island shows a confident and competent group of young men with perhaps 24 missions under their belts by this time and about halfway through their combat tour. They still had many perilous missions ahead of them, some of which would prove quite hair-raising. One of these occurred on September 3, 1944, when the 90th Bomb Group participated in a raid on a Japanese airfield at Langawan in the Celebes Islands. It was a big raid by Pacific War standards. 60 B-24s from the 90th, 43rd, and 22nd Bomb Groups hit the target, wrecking the airfield and destroying many Japanese aircraft on the ground. But some Japanese fighter planes managed to get into the air and attacked the bombers. Flying just to the left of the bomber flown by the Horner crew, a B-24 piloted by Lieutenant Edward J. Mahaney was hit and dropped out of the formation with one engine smoking.
We saw it going down in smoke, and that was the first time we saw a bomber shot down.
Some members of Mahaney's crew managed to bail out as their bomber went down. Their parachutes were seen, but they were never heard from again.
We never heard of a single person that ever parachuted over a Jap base ever came home. We knew that they would torture you for information, and then they would end up by killing you.
As Lieutenant Mahaney's bomber was going down, one of the Japanese fighter planes turned and made a pass at Lieutenant Horner's bomber. But Sergeant Baca saw him coming and was ready at his waist gun.
I remember those fighters came in, they shot Mahoney's crew. The other 3 or 4, I don't know how many they were, they peeled off. But I saw one of them slip under our plane. And I said, I know that guy's coming after us. So right away I was on my gun. And the minute he was within my range, or within my eyesight, I started firing. I saw a part of it blew off. And I heard the bombardier Ostafet say, you got him. But then he continued. And later on, some of the gunners in the other crews finished him off, they said.
Baca got a shot at a plane that passed by outside his window behind the engines, grabbed his guns and locked the triggers down, and the plane flew right through the bullets.
Thanks to Sergeant Baca's marksmanship, which had so impressed his instructors at gunnery school, this Japanese fighter plane would never again menace an American bomber. The remaining fighters broke off their attack, and the American bomber formation returned to base without further losses. Bomber crews soon noticed a pattern in Japanese fighter plane attacks.
If they could get to you before you got to the target, they would attack, but of course their object was to prevent you from bombing their targets. But then the minute you came over their target, they would all disperse because they didn't want to get caught in their own anti-aircraft fire. And then they would be waiting out there after you had gone to their anti-aircraft guns to pounce on you again. What our real defense strategy was that as our bombers were flying, our aim was to throw a wall of fire all around us. Because I think every third or fourth bullet was a tracer, where we could see, And those Japs saw it too, and they got unnerved. They were human.
Not all fighter plane attacks involved gunfire. The Japanese also developed an aerial phosphorus bomb. A Japanese fighter plane could release one of these bombs over a formation of American bombers and shower the bombers with lumps of burning phosphorus.
They had to come at you from the front when they used phosphorus. They come at you at 12 o'clock high, and then they just roll over on their back, split S, and when they kick the bomb out of the belly, and it would go out like a big lump, and then boom, and then all these trails would go out, and they could cover a whole squadron with a bomb.
To me, they looked like a spider because they were spread out, and it was just like the legs of a spider.
It's a lump of white phosphorus, and it's smoking. And it hits your nacelle, or it hits any part of the plane that's got any configuration where it can lodge. and it just sits there and burns right through.
One plane, they got hit on their propeller and it burned right through. We all went to look at that plane after it landed to see a big hole in the propeller, and those propellers were about that thick.
In the South Pacific, an even greater danger than the Japanese was the weather.
We lost 2 or 3 times as many people to weather or weather-related causes than the enemy.
Over there in the Pacific, weather was a big factor. There was not too many flights that we didn't fly through bad weather.
On one occasion, they ran into a storm that was so large and powerful that it must have been a hurricane.
It was just breaking day, and we had just assembled and ran into a full typhoon. We had a full load of bombs, full load of gas, and we hit this wall, and it was black. We hit it after we had gotten together in formation. And all of a sudden, you're doing 5,000 feet a minute up and down, like an express elevator. You go, and something goes by you, either up or down, passing you, a big shadow. And somebody else that's out about 200 feet, and you just, well, that scares the hell out of you.
That plane was going up and down, sideways. Water was pouring in through every side.
And the plane's filling up with water. Rainwater just comes in like a shower, and the water is running on the floor. Everybody's wet.
There were so many openings in the plane that if you ever go into what I figure was almost solid water, there was no way to keep the water from coming in every direction. And finally, he called over the intercom and says, I can't control this plane anymore. He says, put on your parachutes. We're going to have to bail out. And boy, of course. So we put on our parachutes, and we were waiting for him to tell us the word to bail out.